I would like to go over the assignment. Here we have 3 questions, and there's a plus sign next to them. Generally, when you see that, it means that if you click, you're going to see more. So if I click on the question, I see some additional information, the plus sign changes to minus. And I can do that for all 3 questions. If I click again, the minus sign goes back to a plus, and the content disappears. This code will work the same if I add more questions or if I delete a question. So let's take a look at what's happening here. When the page loads, we see the plus sign and the content underneath is hidden. The useful resources section has nothing to do with the assignment. It's just there so that we have a realistic web page. You always first want to take a look at your HTML and CSS. So here we have in the body section, we have our banner. Underneath that, the header. We have a main section and a regular section. All of the action is occurring inside the main element. Inside that element, we have a section element with an ID. We have an H2 a div, an H2 a div, an H2 a div. So we will need to access that H2. The H2 is the recipient of the click event. So we're going to be clicking on all 3 H2s individually. So how do we access that H2? Well, we know it's inside a section with a unique ID, so we could access it that way. We also know that the H2 exists inside this main element, and since that is the only main element on the page, we could also access it that way. These 3 H2 elements constitute an array, so you need to keep that in mind when working with them. You will need to create a function that performs the interaction. That function will be called when the user clicks on one of these 3 H2s. Therefore, we need to have event handlers set up for these 3 H2 elements. You are not going to write 3 statements for 3 click events. This code needs to work if we were to remove an H2 in div or if we were to add more H2s in divs. So if we add or remove questions and answers, the code has to work. Therefore, you need to set the click event using a for loop. The reason we write computer programs is to automate processes. If we look at the web page again, when the page loads, we see a plus sign and the content underneath the question is not shown to us. Again, if you look at the HTML, there are no classes here. So we didn't add any classes to do that, meaning it was set purely with CSS element selectors. So as I said earlier, we have an H2 inside the main element. And I am using the before pseudo element to apply a font. That plus sign is actually a font. It is not an image. It is what is called an icon font, and it exists in the Font Awesome library. I am referencing the Font Awesome library in the link element here in my head section. So when the page loads, we have that plus sign. However, when we click, we want to change that. We're not removing it. What we're doing is we're going to add a class. The class is defined right here. It is the class called minus, indicated by the period before the class name. Even though it is being applied as a pseudo element, the colon before is not part of the class name. This is class equals minus. So we are applying a Font Awesome icon font here. This works because we will be adding this class to the H2 element, and the content, which is the icon font, will override the existing icon font. And when we click again, we will remove this class, so therefore the existing icon font will be displayed. So we are adding and removing a class. Now let's take a look at the div. Here we have a descendant selector, which is accessing that div, and we are setting the CSS display property to none. Therefore, you don't see them when the page loads. What we're going to be doing, we're going to be adding and removing a class called show. This is the class right here, .show. It will set the display property to block. Again, the class will take precedence over the descendant selector. When we remove that class, the initial style will still be applied and we will not see the div anymore. The first thing you always want to do before you start writing any code is to make sure that you can call this function. If you can't click and call the function, there's no sense in trying to test it any further. So I always place an alert at the top of my function, make sure I can call it, then I start writing the code. So here is the logic behind this type of application. Again, we're looking at a toggle similar to something that we worked with a week or two ago, where we're going back and forth between determining if the class is there or if it's not there. So the easiest way to approach this is to first test to see if class equals minus exists. So you would need to write the code to determine if it has the class and if the class has the value of minus. Now, we know when the page loads, there are no classes being set. So obviously this is going to return false and the else is going to take effect. However, when we click the second time, the if will return true, because at that point the class equals minus will be there. So if this condition is true, which it won't be the first time around, but second time around it will be. If it does have the class, then we remove it, and then we also remove the class to the div. The easiest way to access that div is using the next element sibling property. So now let's look at the else section here. So when the page first loads, we will be working in the else. So if the class does not exist, which it won't when the page loads, then we're going to add it. Therefore, we'll see the minus sign. Then we're also going to add a class to the div so that it will be visible. So that's essentially all you're doing, is you're determining if a class exists or not. If it does, you remove it. If it doesn't, you add it. We're going back and forth because the style will already be set by the default CSS. So you're only manipulating one class for the H2 and one class for the div. When you're using JavaScript to add or remove classes, you really need to be using the inspector that comes with the browser. All browsers have this tool. You can see when the page loads here that we have an event connected to the 3 H2s. That's because we use that for loop to set the add event listener method for the click event and the function we are calling. And notice there are no classes. The H2 does not have a class, the div does not have a class. I'm going to click on the first question. Notice what just happened. Now we see class equals minus in the H2, class equals show in the div. Very nice. We also see the change on the web page. Let's click the next question. There we go. If you don't see this, you know your code is not working. Look, always debug the generated HTML first before you start looking at something else. All right, now notice I just clicked the third question. The classes have disappeared. I clicked the second question. The classes have disappeared. Okay, so I can go back and forth. Back and forth, I'm toggling. Okay, so I'm adding the class and I'm removing it. That's all I'm doing. I'm adding the class and I'm removing it. I'm adding the class and I'm removing it. So the only class you're concerned with is the class called minus, and the class called show. I have a demo example in the sample code that shows a similar type of application that you can study to understand this concept further.